The Strong Hermel. Long ago, in the Bergisches land of North Rhine-Westphalia, there lived a young man named Hermel. He would often sit upon a hill, gazing out over the wide green valleys. His hands, large and marked by hard labor, rested calmly together, and a quiet smile lay upon his face. Hermel was tall of stature, broad-shouldered, and possessed such strength that many believed him to be invincible. Yet his heart was as gentle as the wind that moved through the trees. He would not have harmed even a fly. The people of the land knew. Whoever met Hermel encountered kindness and patience. It was difficult to provoke him to anger. Even mockery and injustice he endured in silence, as though they were nothing more than passing clouds. Only when he was directly attacked did he rise, never out of rage but in self-defense. Thus Hermel lived in quiet harmony with the world, strong as the mountains, and yet as peaceful as the landscape around him. But one day, this tranquil life was destined to come to an end. For one day, a foreign heathen people came into the Bergisches land, and with them, terror arrived. They were numerous and better armed, so that hardly anyone could stand against them. With loud cries of war, they swept over the hills, and wherever they went, they left devastation behind. Houses and entire villages were burned to the ground, and anyone who opposed them was slain without mercy. The people fled in fear through the valleys, yet scarcely anyone found safety. Soon the invaders had subdued the entire land. After their conquest, they forced the inhabitants of the Bergisches land to serve them, and the once peaceful region was scarcely recognizable. Under the rule of the heathens, a reign of terror was established in the Bergisches land, such as the region had never known before. Mercilessly, they drove the inhabitants to harsh and inhuman labor, forcing them to toil until their strength gave out. For even the smallest offenses, people were put to death in agony by the heathens, but not only then. A wrong glance, a fleeting moment of weakness was enough, and they were brutally punished. Often it happened without any reason at all, out of sheer cruelty, out of a lust for torment. To the conquerors, the people were nothing more than animals. Day after day, the inhabitants were forced to work under brutal conditions, and hope seemed to have vanished entirely. Hermel, too, was forced to labor for the heathens. Yet while others fell into despair, he remained unbroken within. One day, Hermel was to help with threshing, but no ordinary flail was large enough for a man of his strength. Without hesitation, he went into the forest, tore a tree from the ground with his bare hands, and fashioned his own threshing flail from it. With this, he went to the barn, carefully lifted off the roof as one would remove a lid, and set it aside so that it would not be damaged during the work. Then he began the task. The straw whirled about as if caught in a storm wind. In this way, he finished the entire supply in half an hour. Afterward, he turned the roof over, poured all the grain into its hollow, and shook it like a winnowing basket, blowing into it with full force so that the chaff was carried away. Finally, he carried the grain in large sacks up to the loft and poured it out there. The heathens watched this in astonishment. They realized that Hermel possessed superhuman strength and regarded him as their most valuable laborer. On another day, however, Hermel loaded a wagon with straw, as he had been ordered. But he did it thoroughly, so thoroughly that the wagon was piled with straw high above its wheels. When the 2 oxen harnessed to it tried to pull the load, they strained in vain against their yokes. Not a single movement ran through the burden, for the animals were too weak. Then Hermel stepped forward, grasped the oxen with quiet strength, lifted them effortlessly onto the wagon, and pulled the heavy load up the road by himself, without the slightest effort. The heathen standing nearby watched this with growing unease. This man, they said, could one day become dangerous to us with his strength. So they took counsel in the shadow of the evening. They knew that Hermel's strength was useful to them, but their fear was greater still. At last the heathens agreed that they must be rid of him, and so they devised a plan to kill Hermel. The heathens led Hermel to a deep stone well and said, "Hermel, we want you to climb down into the well and clean it for us." Unsuspecting, Hermel descended into the depths and began his work. Meanwhile, the heathens crept to the edge of the well, hauled heavy boulders into place, and leaned over the opening with dark expressions before pushing the stones down. With a thunderous crash, they hurled them into the shaft, hoping to strike Hermel dead below. But the falling stones did Hermel no harm. The boulders rained down above him, yet he merely looked up calmly and sang a cheerful song, as if nothing had happened. There was no trembling, no anger to be seen in him. Only when ever larger stones came crashing down did he call up, "Drive those chickens away from the edge of the well. They are scratching gravel and dust into my eyes so that I can no longer work." The heathens were not deterred by Hermel's mockery. As a second attempt, they together rolled a massive round millstone into place. With combined strength, they pushed it to the edge of the stone well, and at last tipped the heavy stone over the opening until it plunged into the depths. "Now he will mock us no more," they cried in triumph. They believed that even Hermel's great strength could not withstand such a weight. But instead, a hearty laugh rang out from the depths of the well. Hermel still stood down below, very much alive, looking up with a calm, almost cheerful expression. Around his neck lay the massive millstone. "1,000 thanks, dear sirs," he called up, "for the fine collar you have thrown down to me." Then the heathens resolved to make one final attempt. With combined strength, they dragged a massive tower bell to the edge of the well. Then they let it go, and the bell plunged into the depths. "Now he is finally dead," they cried with satisfaction. They firmly believed that even Hermel's strength could not withstand this burden. For a moment Hermel's song fell silent, but at once he called up laughing from the depths, "1,000 thanks, dear sirs, for the fine cap you have thrown down to me." The heathens clutched their heads in shock and stared down in disbelief. Hermel, however, had just finished his work. Calmly he climbed up out of the well, stood before them, and spoke with composure. "I bear you no ill will for your little jests. Only you must let me keep the fine things you have thrown down to me as a gift." At this the heathens fell silent and took counsel once more. This time they resolved to call upon darker powers to finally be rid of Hermel. The heathens therefore sent Hermel to the devil's mill to grind grain there. No one dared to go near the place, for a demon dwelt there and slew anyone who approached. The heathens hoped that this demon would finally kill Hermel. But Hermel hoisted several heavy sacks of grain onto his shoulders and set off down the path without fear, for he had never heard of devils or demons at that place. When he arrived at the mill, he poured out the grain and calmly set the mill in motion. The wheel began to turn, the water rushed, and soon the grinding of the millstone filled the room. Then Hermel heard noises from outside, and when he looked, the demon emerged, a dreadful creature with glowing eyes, horns, and great wings. It hurled itself at Hermel, but he seized it without effort, dragged it into the mill, and forced it down upon the millstone. While the demon writhed and screamed, Hermel held it fast, unshaken. Sparks and flames burst from its body, and in desperation the creature begged for mercy. But Hermel did not relent until the demon's left leg had been completely ground away. Only then did he release it. Calmly he filled the flour into sacks and returned with them, well satisfied. The heathens marveled when they saw him return unharmed, and even more when they heard how he had overcome the demon. Then they resolved that now the devil himself must come to finally defeat Hermel. At daybreak the heathens summoned the strong Hermel and said, "Hermel, you are making us poor men. Go down into hell to the devil and bring us a sack of gold as large and heavy as you can carry." So they led him to a great mountain, where the entrance to a cave descended into the depths of the underworld. As Hermel disappeared within, they rejoiced. "Now we are rid of him at last." But Hermel walked fearlessly through the long, dark cavern until he reached a massive iron gate. When it would not open, he struck it with such force that it burst apart with a crash. Beyond it lay a vast cavernous realm filled with blazing flames. Everywhere were demonic beings with horns, wings, and glowing eyes. Hermel descended a staircase, drove away the fluttering bats, and encountered the demon whose leg he had ground away the day before. At the sight of him, the creature fled, howling. At last, Hermel came before the devil himself, who sat upon a throne of fire, surrounded by countless demons. Yet Hermel looked calmly, almost kindly, upon the dreadful being. The devil asked him, "Who are you, and what do you want here?" Hermel answered simply that his masters had sent him to fetch a sack of gold. Then the devil smiled and said, "You are a strong fellow. I will give you 3 challenges. If you succeed in matching them, the gold shall be yours. But if you fail, your soul will belong to me." "Agreed," said Hermel without hesitation. Then the devil brought forth a mighty hunting horn and said with a dark smile, "Now let us see who can blow the strongest." First the devil blew into the horn, and so powerfully that the whole mountain of hell trembled. The flames flickered, and 6 of the blazing fires around them were extinguished. Then it was Hermel's turn. Calmly he took the horn in his strong hands, raised it to his lips, and blew into it with all his might. There was a tremendous crack, and the horn burst into pieces. A splinter flew and struck the devil on the head, making his horns shake. At the same time, countless fires around them went out, nearly 100, and hell was suddenly left almost in darkness. Even the demons recoiled in fear. Next, the devil lifted a massive boulder and hurled it high into the air with great force, so that it nearly struck the vault of hell. Now it was Hermel's turn. He took a boulder into his strong hands, weighed it thoughtfully back and forth, and looked upward with a measuring gaze. Then he said calmly, "Before I throw, I will go outside and fetch some sturdy oak trees." "What do you want with those?" the devil asked in confusion. "To support the vault," Hermel replied calmly, "so that it does not collapse when I throw the stone against it." At this, fear seized the devil. He saw the man's immense strength before him and dreaded the destruction of his realm should everything come crashing down. Under a pretense, he turned away in haste and vanished into the flames of hell. Hermel, however, took hold of the sack of gold and set off on his return. When he came back to the heathens, they could scarcely believe their eyes. Though they rejoiced at the treasure, they were already devising yet another treacherous plan to finally put Hermel to death. A few days later, the heathens sent Hermel into the forest to fell wood. With powerful blows he brought down the trees and stacked the trunks neatly one upon another, so that entire rows of timber piles arose. When the work was done, Hermel lay down, as was his custom, beneath a great tree. He folded his arms behind his head, and with a contented smile, closed his eyes. In the cool shade of the trees he rested while the forest lay still around him. But this was the very moment the heathens had been waiting for. Hidden among the trees they kept watch for him, and the devil himself was not far away. Secretly they observed the sleeping Hermel, who lay unsuspecting among the felled trunks. The heathens, together with the devil and his demons, had devised one final cruel plan to destroy Hermel once and for all. In the blazing depths of hell, the devil had a chain forged, red-hot, infused with demonic power, unbreakable even for the strongest man. And so, while Hermel slept, the devil and his dark servants crept forward. Silently, they placed the burning chain around his chest and arms and bound him fast to the trunk. Only when the glowing iron touched his skin did Hermel start up from his sleep. He tensed his muscles and tried to break free, but the chain held him fast without mercy. Then the heathens stepped forth, their faces filled with malicious joy. They set fire to the stacked timber and to the trees and bushes all around Hermel. Soon the flames rose high, like a raging sea of fire that enclosed him on all sides. The heat became unbearable. Hermel's clothes burned away, then the flames bit into his flesh. A cry tore from his chest, such as no one had ever heard from him before. Behind the flames the heathens rejoiced, while above them the demons and the devil laughed wickedly. They believed that Hermel was lost. But then the unimaginable happened. Within Hermel awoke a fury and a hatred, such as he had never known before, a blazing, unyielding will. This rage gave him new strength. His muscles tightened, and with a mighty wrench he tore apart the demonic bonds as though they were nothing more than thin thread. The devil and his demons were so terrified by Hermel's unleashed strength that they fled back to hell in panicked haste. Only the heathens remained, now standing in fear and dread before the man they had sought to destroy. Hermel stood before them amid the flames, his skin scarred by the fire, yet his eyes filled with vengeance. With a mighty heave, he seized the tree to which he had been bound and tore it from the earth, roots and all. Earth and splinters flew as he lifted the massive trunk and swung it like a club. The heathens tried to defend themselves with their spears and swords, but these weapons were powerless. One after another they were struck down and hurled to the ground by Hermel. Like a storm, he swept through the entire Bergisches land. Wherever the heathens gathered, his vengeance fell upon them. Whole armies were crushed by him, and some of the slain he impaled upon a long pole and slung across his shoulders. The flames they had kindled against him now became their own destruction. Soon, the few survivors realized that they were lost. In panicked fear, they fled from the Bergisches land and never dared to return. But Hermel's thirst for vengeance was not yet satisfied, for the devil and his demons had wronged him as well, and now their punishment would come. Thus the strong Hermel climbed the mountain that led down into hell. When he reached the summit, he began to stamp upon the ground with mighty leaps. Again and again he hurled down his full weight and strength so that the mountain trembled beneath him. With each impact, the trembling grew stronger. Cracks spread through the rock, and deep below him, the vault of hell began to break apart. At last there came a thunderous crash, and the cavernous roof of hell gave way. As this happened, the devil and his demons looked up in terror. At once they recognized who had brought this destruction upon them, and why. Massive stones and whole masses of rock plunged into the depths, dragging the devil and his demons down with them. One after another, they were hurled into the darkest chasms of the earth, buried beneath stone and fire. For a long time, hell would not recover from this blow. Thus Hermel had completed his vengeance. The inhabitants of the Bergisches land gathered as the news of Hermel's victory spread. Joy and relief were written on their faces, for the reign of terror of the heathens had finally been broken. Hermel himself was heavily marked by fire and battle, yet he stood upright and alive. Soon more and more people pressed toward him, embracing him with joy and thanking him for his heroic deed. Hermel himself was overwhelmed and deeply moved by this affection. He, who had fought entirely alone against demons and heathens, now felt the warmth of an entire people. And in that moment, he fully realized that he had become the liberator of his homeland. Very soon after all the battles, Hermel also found the woman who would be his wife for life. In time, the two were married and became the happiest couple in all the Bergisches land. Then, on the evening after their wedding, the newly married pair went to the place where Hermel had always sat, gazing dreamily over the landscape. There, at that place so familiar to him, they began their life together. In the warmth of that evening, they conceived their first child, while the liberated land lay still and wide beneath them. At that very spot, Hermel later built a house for himself, his wife, and the child growing within her. Thus Hermel and his family lived on in happiness and contentment. The times of fear were over, and in their place a new life had begun, one filled with love, hope, and peace, lasting until the end of their days.